Speaking of the American Civil War, I don't quite understand why. It just seemed to be a time where a lot of gambling went on. And something to do with the generals, and it has something to do with the nature of the events. But there's just a lot of stuff happened in the Civil War, including just, one of the sections in the book, as you know, is called the Roll of Luck, where just incredible lucky events occurred. And so there's a Civil War event, which was very significant in history, was just based on luck, pure luck.
Hi, and welcome. It's Runchuks, and you're listening to my podcast where I explore the topics around what it takes to become a great poker player with various interesting people from in and around poker industry. Today my guest is Mason Malmuth. He is the founder of TwoPlusTwo Publishing, author of many books, and in many ways one of the key figures in the poker world. He has a new book out. It's a history book, where he looks at historical events through a lens of gambling. And it's a very enjoyable read. Now, this is a wide-ranging conversation where we talk about gambling in general, discuss some stories from the book, and talk about poker, what makes a good game, what defines a good player. We talk about the Rake, about regulation, poker room politics, tournament structures, and so much more. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do too. Thank you for coming on. I'm really happy that that we're going to have this conversation.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about our new book.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's actually the reason why I reached out to you. Because as soon as I read the title and the premise of the book, I thought, wow, first of all, I never heard anybody look at the history from this lens before. It's such a fascinating topic, such an interesting idea. So maybe let's actually start talking about the book. And then we will transition to other topics, all poker related, of course.
Well, in 1987, I self-published a book called Gambling Theory and Other Topics. And in the last section of that book, which was called Gambling Fantasy, I had a little bit of this history stuff where I looked at some things I knew about history and could see where where gambles were taking place. And so for all this time, it's a topic that I've thought on and off about. I happen to like to read history, so as I would read history, occasionally, every now and then, I would see something that would qualify as either a gamble or at least it exhibited some aspect of gambling. So I guess about a year and a half ago, I finally decided, I guess it's 30 years later, I finally decided I wanted to do a book. Of course, I still didn't know enough history. So I put a call out on our website, and a man named Antonio Carrasco answered. I was looking for somebody who understood, gambling and poker to some degree at least, and also was a historian. Well, just by luck, I found the perfect guy. So I now had a historian to work with. So I sent him an outline of what I had in mind. And he got back to me and he said, well, this all sounds good, except that you have too much from North America, and basically most of the stuff is from the last 200 years. So he then sent me a list of about 30 topics to read about, which I could get on the internet and start reading. And we began to add more and more topics in. And I wrote, some of the chapters, and he wrote some of the chapters, and then we go over them. And the key is really not so much the history, even though that makes it interesting, but where the aspects of gambling took place. And in the first section of the book, we have to define what we're doing. So we define two things. First, we define gambling. And gambling is a topic that we all talk about, but is never really defined very well. So we define gambling as an endeavor or an event that has two qualities. First, it has an expectation. And second, it has a variance or the square root of the variance is standard deviation. We use that too. And the key is that the variance has to be large relative to the expectation. So if, let's say you're playing poker, and just to throw some simple numbers out, you're making $10 an hour, but you have a standard deviation of $100. Well, that means that if you keep doing this, you're playing with a positive expectation, but you can't really predict very well where you're going to finish because of the variance. So therefore, you're gambling. On the other hand, if you reverse those numbers and your expectation was 100, but the standard deviation was 10, now you would not be gambling, because now you can predict with a fair amount of certainty how you're going to finish. Now, there's a little interesting aspect of this that comes into play in one of the chapters, and it's the idea that if you keep gambling, well, statistically, the standard deviation is proportional to the square root of the number of events, which could be poker hands that you play. And the expectation is proportional to the number of events or poker hands you play. And in simpler language, what that means is that over time, the expectation will begin to dominate. And one of the interesting things from that is that I can go play poker, and so I go down to my favorite poker room, which here in Las Vegas is the Bellagio. So I go there and I play for a few hours. Well, I'm gambling. I mean, my results can be all over the place. But if I keep doing this every night, night after night after night, eventually I'm not gambling anymore because my expectation now dominates. So that's a little bit of the way that this works. And then we brought in another idea, which first appeared in my gambling theory book. In fact, let me ask you this question. You go to a craps table and you bet $1 a roll, and you do that, let's say, for 10,000 rolls. Now, the very next roll, you bet $1 million. How many times have you rolled the dice?
Right, yeah. Yeah, I remember that part because I did read your book, by the way, even though on the short notice. But the idea is that the statistician would say that you rolled once for all intents and purposes, right? Whereas, from another perspective, you rolled 10,001 time.
Well, the first 10,000 rolls, I picked up a statistical term from the United States Census Bureau where I worked at years ago. And that would be called self-weighting. So the first 10,000 rolls are what we call self-weighting sample. Then once you add that $1 million roll in, it's now become non-self-weighting. And we used to try to design statistical surveys so they were self-weighting. And the reason for that was it reduced the variance. Now, that's an issue poker players deal with all the time, trying to reduce the variance. And when you make it non-self-weighting, and this example shows it, instead of having a sample size of 10,001, you really only have a sample size of 1. You're starting to increase the variance. And what's important here is the right way to gamble is non-self-weighting. In other words, you don't bet every football game. You bet those games where you think the bookie's line is off by enough to where you have an edge. In other words, you can cover the bookie's fee and you still have an edge. And the larger your edge is, the more you bet. The same is true with poker. If you had a full table of poker players, you don't play every hand. You only play a selective number of hands. And the stronger your hand is, the more aggressively you play it. So that led to the idea of non-self-weighting strategies as being the right way to gamble. So those two ideas of exactly what gambling is, specifically that the short-term luck factor is large compared to the expected outcome, and and the idea of non-self-weighting strategies. That's the basis behind this book. So we're looking at all sorts of events of history. Some of them were positive, and some were negative. We have a bunch of foolish gambles in the book.
Yeah.
And we also have a section called Poker Plays.
Yeah. And even in some of the, I don't remember which section that is in, but I think in the expert gambles, right? Or the expert,
Yes.
expert gambles. That was the section. Even some of the gambles that you described, you classify them as good sort of decisions, yet some of them still didn't work out, which is an important thing to obviously always mention. That
one of the expert gambles that did not work out was in World War I. Was the German U-boat fleet. They were, for political reasons, a lot of it dealing with the United States, because the United States was not in the war. They kind of quit the U-boat attacks. But as the war went on, Germany was starting to struggle, so they made a decision to resume the U-boat attacks. And they lost the war, so you could say, well, that decision failed. But in our opinion, it was still an expert decision because it gave them a chance to win when they really had no chance before that. Mm-hmm. So that would be one of the examples you're talking about.
Yeah. And to me, the interesting thing that I took away from this book is something that I haven't really considered much before, because obviously, like, if we just think about these events in history, all events can be viewed from a lens of gambling if we define gambling as, with the variance is higher than the expected outcome, right? So
it's a relative number. In other words, the statisticians, the thing they really study is the standard deviation. And there are formulas for this, and the standard deviation turns out to be the square root of the variance. But the idea is just what you said. When the variance or standard deviation is large compared to what your expectation is. And so, some of the events in the book, that's kind of an opinion. Mm-hmm. But that's basically the idea behind gambling.
Yeah. So the surprising idea to me was, or not surprising, but just something that I quite appreciated, was the idea that sometimes it makes sense to gamble to increase the variance so that your chances of winning go from pretty much zero to something way higher than zero, even though you increase the variance. But, it sort of was counterintuitive, something that I haven't thought much about before. And with some of the examples that he illustrated, especially in the war situations where the battle is lost if you just pursue the normal strategy. But if you deviate and sort of gamble on the fact that your opponent is not going to adapt properly, all of a sudden your chances of winning go way up.
Right. When you can increase if you're a losing player, and this could be a poker player or a general or someone in the business field, but if you're losing and it's important to win, by increasing the variance, even though you may lower your expectation, you can actually increase your chances of having a winning outcome over the play of the event. You won't, now if you keep repeating the event over and over again, in the long run, you'll have worse results. But if you're fighting a battle, you only have, you don't have the opportunity to repeat the event over and over again. You're doing it just this one time. So, I can give a poker example because I bet almost everybody who's listening to the show has seen this, and in many cases have done it themselves. You'll see a player who's losing for the night. And actually, this comes out of my psychology book, but it's important to him to be a winner for the night. and he only has a little bit of time left. Well, what does he do? He starts to play more aggressively. He starts to play more hands, and he's actually lowering his expectation. However, he's increasing his probability of leaving that one session as a winner. And so this is something that comes up at the end of the book. You get these events that, boy, when you first look at them, they just don't make much sense. But they were right, because it meant that instead of being sure to lose, you had a chance to win.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially because as you said, in a battle, for example, you only have this one event. So it doesn't really matter that you lower your overall expected value. What matters is that all of a sudden you're not just having an expectation to lose every time, that you're actually opening yourself up to a chance.
A good example of this, which appears in the book, and this chapter was mostly put together by my co-author, was the story of Francisco Pizarro. He's down in South America, and he's got an army. I think it's 120 conquistadors, maybe it's 180 is the number. But he's up against 20,000 Incas. I mean, so standard strategy is one of two choices. One, he could try to fight, which he has no chance. And the other is he could try to run, which he'll have very little chance. So what do? He came up with a third strategy, which was a huge gamble. And it would probably not work most of the time, but it happened to work the time he executed it. And basically what that strategy was, he sent his emissaries out to the Inca king, who was leading the army, and invited him in for a friendly meeting. And of course, I guess the Incas didn't understand how treacherous the Spaniards could be. So the Inca king came in, and the idea was to capture the Inca king. And then once you captured him, the Inca army wouldn't have a leader anymore. And that's what they did. They attacked the Inca king, and he came in with a couple of thousand soldiers. But as a gesture of goodwill, they were disarmed. So the Spanish, even though they were much smaller numbers, had superior weapons. So they attacked them, they captured the king, and the whole Inca army ended up dissolving and running away. So that's how you take it. Was a complete gamble. It probably would not work most of the time, but it gave them a chance to survive and win.
Yeah, exactly. Because otherwise, they have no chance at all,
right,
against the 20,000 strong, and even those 2,000 people, 2,000 Incas that came together with the king. The part that they came unarmed, it's sort of luck, sure.
Yeah.
But that's part of the gambling. You're hoping for a positive outcome. You're hoping either because many of the events described in your book were to do with the weather, which is interesting, which obviously influenced a lot of the military events throughout the history. And another example of the same thing that we're talking about right now with the Incas was also that event that you described of General Lee fighting the defensive battle. I don't remember which was the city, Richmond or something.
Right. It was the city of Richmond in the state of Virginia, and which is which was part of it was the capital of the Southern Confederacy. And one of the sections in the book is called Poker Plays. And I consider Robert E. Lee to be the greatest poker player that ever lived. He's a little bit out of favor today because of all the going-ons. And, he was leading the army to defend slavery and so on. But as a strategist, I don't think there's anybody better. And the irony of it is I don't think he ever played poker. I know that he was negative towards anything gambling. But in the year the American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865. And it was an all-consuming war. There was 600,000 people killed. huge number of additional casualties. But early in the Civil War, 1862, the North, or the Union, had a very large army, and they were over 100,000 men, and they had moved to outside the city of Richmond. And Lee had an army of about 60,000 men, and he had to defend the city of Richmond. Well, in addition to having a larger army, the Northern Army was probably better trained, and so they were certainly better equipped. They were better fed. They were just better everything. So if Lee fights like he's supposed to, which would be to set up defensive lines and try to resist the incoming army, he'll slowly be crushed. So he comes up with a battle plan based on a semi-bluff. And I guess David Sklansky was the first person to define what a semi-bluff is, but most poker players are well aware of it. And what they did was they noticed that one wing of the Union Army was on the other side of, I think it's the Chickahominy River. I think that was the name of the river. And they were a little bit separated from the rest of the army. So what he did was he took most of his army, swung them around to the side, and attacked that wing. And then in front of the city of Richmond, he left a small number of troops. And their job was to just make as much noise as possible. So he had them marching around and shooting their guns, and they were instructed, not to fight. And if the Union Army, which was commanded by a man named George McClellan, and this is the key to it, George McClellan was very conservative. So Lee recognized this. But if McClellan would have moved the Union Army forward, they would have captured the city of Richmond easily, and the war had been over. But what happens is McClellan starts getting casualty reports from this one side of his army. He gets no casualty reports from the rest of the army. Now, the reason it's a semi-bluff is if they're able to run through the wing of the army, this is Lee's army, he's able to run through the McClellan's army, and then continues on to the rest of the army, they actually might win the whole battle. There's only a small chance of that happening. So what they're really hoping is that McClellan folds his hand and retreats. And that's exactly what happened. McClellan became convinced that he was being attacked by overwhelming numbers on all sides, even though he only had casualty reports from one part of his army, and retreated. And that saved the city of Richmond and ended up prolonging the American Civil War for, I guess, 3 more years. And so we have 3 chapters on him in the book. He did another semi-bluff at another battle, and then in a third battle, he did an outright bluff. And so we view him as at least I do, as the greatest American gambler, maybe probably the greatest gambler of all time.
It's interesting that he also mentioned that he himself viewed gambling as a vice, and he was against gambling as such.
That's my understanding.
And I think it's important I actually want to hear your thoughts, because you've been in and around gambling industry for such a long time. And it's obvious that in some other industries, people would benefit greatly from a better understanding of what gambling is and how to analyze decisions from a perspective of the standard deviation, the expected value, so sort of more rationally. Whereas that doesn't seem to happen that much. People view gambling as this bad thing, and it has nothing to do with business. It has nothing to do with politics. It has nothing to do with this and that. Whereas if we think about it, everything has some sort of element of gambling at some point.
Well, perhaps, but I think most things really don't. I think these gambling events tend to be kind of rare. I know on our website, when I first announced wanted to do a book like this, people several people posted that I had to write about D-Day, in World War II, and what a big gamble that was. But in our opinion, it wasn't a gamble at all. It was something that was very well thought out, and it was very well executed. And they knew it would be well executed. I mean, they had some problems, but to me, it didn't have a large enough variance compared to the expectation to count as a gambling event. Mm-hmm. And I think that's often true in all sorts of things. Now, in the gambling business, this goes back, I think, to the beginning of casinos is the idea that they like to keep the people dumb so the people will make terrible mistakes. And a very good example of that is if you go to a baccarat pit, you'll see these people writing down whether it was, what the order of the banker and the player are winning. And of course, that has, and you see that roulette too. They'll keep track of whether it was red or black. And of course, that has basically nothing to do with the game. And that brings you to the idea that probability theory can be very counterintuitive. And so between these things, the casinos did a pretty good job of keeping their customers dumb. And what's ironic about it, they even kept a lot of their employees dumb. I said the employees believed this stuff. They would never be able to teach the customers that it wasn't right. And so I think that answers part of what you just asked.
Mm-hmm. Well, the probability is a different sort of thing, though, because what I was referring to, and for example, your mention of the D-Day not being a gamble, which I agree with your assessment that, they had it well thought through and et cetera, but the element that is important there is to analyze a decision as if, for example, a decision of launching the offensive from a lens of what is going to be the standard deviation here. So as if how much risk do we have and what are the expected outcomes? And
well, I think the answer to that is just opinion. If your opinion is that the standard deviation is small, which was my opinion, looking at that in hindsight, it would not be a gamble. If you look at the same data and you feel the standard deviation is higher, then it becomes a gamble.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's my point exactly. That it would benefit a lot of people, especially in the business world, because I feel like in the military world, people are more accustomed to analyzing the expected outcomes and estimating the risk a bit better. And in the business world, a lot of people know that on paper you're supposed to quantify all the risks and quantify all the outcomes, but that not always happens.
Well, we're actually getting into psychology stuff, but most people live in the real world. And in the real world, things can get very big. And things can also get very small and even go negative. For example, if you're a successful poker player, you can build up a very big bankroll. If you're a bad poker player, your bankroll can go to zero, and if you borrow money, it can even become negative. But when you start looking at risks and that sort of thing, you now have entered the probabilistic world. And in that world, you can only go from 0 to 1, where 0 means that there's no probability of something happening, and 1 means it absolutely must happen. And the probabilistic world can be very tricky for a lot of people. Again, I just mentioned, but probability theory can be very counterintuitive. I'll just give you a simple example. This is in my psychology book. But when I play poker, people know I'm supposed to be some sort of mathematician. And every now and this has happened to me several times. I've been in a game where somebody has been dealt, this is Hold'em, somebody has been dealt aces 2 hands in a row. and they'll ask me, what's the probability of being dealt aces 2 hands in a row? Well, let's see how you do on this. The odds of being dealt aces once is 220 to 1. So what's the odds of being dealt aces 2 hands in a row?
Boy, is it... Okay, I was about to blurt something out, but...
Oh, why don't you? Because let's see what it is.
Because the probability of getting aces twice in a row is the same as probability of having 2 hand combinations, specific hand combinations being dealt. It doesn't matter if it's aces and aces, it's the same as aces and for example, and kings.
Well, that's correct, but it's really a trick question. If you play Hold'em, what's the probability you'll be dealt aces? It's 1. You're going to sit there and play. So eventually you'll be dealt aces. So now the probability of it being dealt aces on the very next hand is 220 to 1. On the other hand, if I said to you, what's the probability of being dealt aces on these 2 specific hands, then it's all right, like 46 or 47,000 to 1. Mm-hmm. And that's just an example of how these things are counterintuitive to people. You have these events that are in reality much more common than they realize, because they didn't start counting until after the first event happened. And I think these kind of stuff, my cat's on the desk, is about to knock everything over. I think that this type of stuff confuses people in the business world, and that's why you occasionally see these terrible mistakes. They think that things are much less likely to happen than they do. And so just going back to poker, people will say, well, I had 3 bad beats in an hour. They really only had 2 bad beats in an hour, because they didn't start counting until after the first bad beat. And the probability of the first bad beat happening eventually is a certainty. So that kind of stuff doesn't have much play in the history book, but in the psychology of poker area, get him out of here. We have this cat who moved into the office about 3 years ago. And he wants to be petted all the time. Most cats want you to leave him alone.
I like the fact that he just moved in. The way you put it is interesting.
But anyway, these are things that confuse people. And they, unless you have a little bit of a background in this stuff or worked with this stuff, people make mistakes. Mm-hmm. And these mistakes can be at times very, very significant.
Yeah. And of course, it's the whole problem of selection bias. And when do we start paying attention to things? It happens in so many fields and so many situations. Because as you mentioned, the bad beat it's a certainty that it's going to happen.
Right.
Now, when it happens and then you start counting, well, you're just selecting the arbitrary point at which you start counting. And same goes for...
Right.
And what makes, aces twice in a row more special than aces and then 7 deuce in a row? We don't care about, I got aces and I got 7 deuce. That doesn't register as something extraordinary to us. But It's the same thing as having aces and aces. It's just, it shouldn't be. But as humans, we are so good at recognizing the patterns, right? So we know, aces and aces again. Oh my God. Or the best is like, I just had exactly the same cards. I had a queen of hearts the hand before. Isn't it incredible? No, it's not.
Well, it would be incredible, or at least very, very unlikely. Can't get rid of them. It would be incredible or very unlikely if you said, what are my chances of this happening on like the next two hands? In other words, you've named specific hands.
Mm-hmm.
But if you wait and don't start counting until after it happens once, it's a lot different.
Mm-hmm.
It's just one of the many ways that gambling confuses people. And the casinos kind of like that because it would encourage people to gamble, and they wouldn't understand what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I remember being introduced to people who I was told, well, this is so-and-so, and he's a great craps player. You know, unless he's cheating or something, there are no great craps players. And, but, you know, this was a guy, I guess he probably had a couple of lucky runs in his life. So, and that's the key to a lot of this stuff, is that the fluctuations can be very high, and the time span that the player is participating in it is short, so that they can get fooled by the short-term luck factor.
Mm-hmm.
And that happens in poker, it happens in other gambling games, and it happens in history.
Let's stay on this topic a bit. Because, of course, the luck is such a huge factor, and especially short-term, huge factor. When we talk about the best players in poker, how do we define who are the best players? What's your opinion on that?
Well, it has to be the people who've had very good long-term results. You know, just getting away from that, there's some people who won the lottery twice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, are they good lottery players? I mean, it's just what luck does to you.
Mm.
But
well, that's why I'm asking this question, because I thought about it a great deal lately myself, right? Because a lot of people tend to name the 5 top players right now in PLO cash games or something like that. And I actually thought about it. I thought like, okay, well, how do we define it? Do we take longevity as the span of, let's say, number of hands played and the results over a number of hands as a defining factor? The problem with that is the game evolves. You know, if you played 1 million or 10 million hands over the period of the last 20 years, well, the hands that you played this year are very different to the hands you played 10 years ago. The game evolved.
That's absolutely correct. The way to I'm going to now argue you can't do it. The way to determine well, there is a way, maybe. The way to determine I'm getting ahead of myself, but in the world of statistics, there's classical statistics and there's what we call Bayesian statistics. Now, I'm not a real expert here, but Bayesian statistics is the idea that you can take in other information. So let's say the argument is who's a better poker player, you or I? So to see that from a classical standpoint, we'd have to each play a huge number of hands. And remember, as more and more hands you play, the expectation begins to dominate the short-term luck factor. So if after a huge number of hands, I've done a little better than you could argue that maybe I'm the better player. Of course, you could also say, well, the games have changed so much. So maybe over this time period, you might have been the better player, but you're not necessarily a better player today. Now, the other way to look at this is to find someone with pretty good results and then try to take in what other information there is. Has he had these results against other players who were tough? Has anybody talked to him? Has he released information about how he plays? And so on. And then you can look at this other information and you can say, wow, that's really good. You know, a good example, this came up on our website a few years ago, and I forget the guy's name, but he won the World Series of Poker. And on the last hand, in an interview, he said something like, my mental coach told me I needed to visualize that a deuce would come on the end. And I forgot to do that. Well, you hear that, you can't help but think that this guy was just probably very lucky. So there was an example of somebody releasing some information which clearly didn't make any sense. On the other hand, if you got, well, a real good example was Dan Harrington, and this goes back to 2003 when the first Harrington book came out. But he detailed in there, how he played and what he looked for and things he did and so on. And it was very clear that for the games at that time, that this was really a superior strategy. Mm-hmm. So you could say very, very clearly, well, Dan Harrington had just made the final table of the World Series of Poker in 2003 and 2004, and he was also a former World Series of Poker champion. So you can say, based on his results, plus this other information that's come along, that this person was a very, very strong poker player. Mm-hmm. And clearly it's probably, at least at that, he's retired now, but clearly, one of the very best poker players at that time. So that's the way you'd have to look at it. So to answer your question, I would try to find people who, let's say the last year or two, that's fairly recent, who had very good results, and then see what other information there is that is available about how they play and what they know about poker and so on. Mm. And if that information is available, it might allow you to either include him into the group of really being a top player or make you think that maybe he was a little bit more lucky.
Right. Well, that's the thing, though. We can, because I think the problem is, well, it's not really a problem. It's just a peculiarity of the whole situation, is that we can define who the top players are, but to rank them, I don't believe that's possible, because first of all, there are so many other aspects into whatever metric we choose. If we choose to focus or zoom in on their results, the expected results, if somehow we can quantify that, there are so many other things that go into that equation, as things like game selection, right? Because that's going to have a huge influence on your numbers.
Well, you could argue, though, that game selection is part of the poker skill.
Oh, well, absolutely. But then, if we're trying to quantify who is a better player A or player B, so what do we try to quantify exactly? Do we try to quantify who is better at the business of poker, or who is a more skilled player? That's something that not many people talk about, because I always get confused when somebody asks me, well, name top 5 or top 3. I'm always at the loss.
It's more complex than that. Let's say I'm an expert at using game theory type strategies, and you're an expert at using exploitative type strategies. Who's the better player? In certain situations, I would be the better player, because it would be very difficult to exploit certain type of opponents. In other situations, the exploited player, especially if there's a bad player in the game, the exploited player is going to do much better. Yet the exploited player cannot beat the game theory player. So, and then you add on top of that the short-term luck factor. It's really, I guess it's just something interesting to speculate about. But no answer will be very good.
Interesting. But, to quantify it, because let's take your example even further, right? We have a GTO player and an exploitative player, and then we add the factor of game selection in it. But let's not forget that the exploitative player is going to get into better games, because the GTO player, this little whiz kid with glasses and a hoodie and whatnot, is not going to have the doors open if we're talking about the cash games. He's not going to get the invitation.
Unless the little whiz kid is playing in like extremely high limit games, where virtually everybody is extremely good. Then it would reverse. So it's, I guess another way to put it is, would you rather be an exploitative expert or a GTO expert? So it's a little different question.
Mm-hmm.
But in my opinion, you'd much rather be the exploitative expert. Now you'd concentrate on game selection. Maybe you don't play as big because in the bigger games, the players are better. But overall, as long as the games are still relatively good, you're going to win more money.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if it's important to you to be seen in the highest stakes games against the toughest players, then you would not want to be the exploitative player.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly the key issue here, because it boils down to what drives you. Why are you playing? Because everybody has a different reason. Some people are in it for the money. Some people are in it for the fun, and some are in it to prove to the world that, hey, I'm the best.
I know before the show we talked a little bit about the business of poker, but this is an example, I think, where things have gone wrong in poker. On the internet, people began to realize you could play more hands. This goes back a lot of years. And then they realized you could multi-table. And on our website, this is years ago, it was an article. I think it was an article submitted to us, which we published we have a magazine on our website. We put out once a month. And the article basically said something like, it was directed at David Sklansky and myself. It said, you guys are trying to explain the best possible way to play poker hand. And you do that so you can make the most money you can on the poker hand. I'm going to play 100 times more hands than you are, make a lot less on each of them. I'm going to use a simple algorithmic type strategy. I'm going to play 15, 20 games at one time on the internet. And at the end of the year, I'm going to make more money than you do, even though you understand how to play poker a lot better than I do. It's very, very interesting. Well, here comes our cat again. All right, you get petted now. So these are issues that have to be dealt with. Now, one of the things a lot of these internet poker sites have realized is the multi-tabling is now long-term bad. So they liked it at first because they created, instead of getting, one rake from you, they got 20 rakes from you. Now they realize that it's destroying a lot of the games. What are we going to do with you?
So let's zoom in on that a bit, because obviously there's been quite a change lately. If we look at PokerStars, for example, they limited the number of tables that you can play to 4.
I think that's a good decision.
So what's in your opinion the biggest problem that multi-tabling poses?
Well, again, this goes back to the psychology of poker. And this goes back to stuff in my psychology book. But one of the things players would like to do is get rid of the variance. They would like to play with at least a very small variance, or put in simpler terms, that they'd like there not to be much of a luck factor. And so what they began to realize was, instead of playing 1 10-20 game, they could play 10 1-2 games. And if everything was equal, they would have the same win rate over the 10 1-2 games as they would over the 1 10-20 game. But they now need a bankroll 1/10 the size. And that's because all hands are played independently. So what that did was it brought professional type players into very small stakes games. It used to be, if you walked into a card room or when the internet sites began, if you went to a small limit game, you had basically no pros playing. The pros were all in the higher games. And that was very good because it allowed, plus they have a lot lower rakes now too, but it allowed new players to learn something about the game and survive and become, at least some of them would become poker players. But because of the multi-tabling, the pros began to move down in stakes. And they also began to move to these simpler algorithmic strategies. So they would give up some of their win rate per hand, but play so many more hands that, in a sense, they'd make more money. And the extreme case of this was when the sites like, this is not a little bit of another issue, but PokerStars used to have stuff where if you played X number of hands, you got bonus money. And you ended up with people who would play a huge number of hands because of all the multi-tabling. And they were just trying to break even as a player or maybe just lose a little bit. But then the bonus money gave them a nice income for the year. And that's not what you want in poker, because now when a recreational type player would show up and again, the game, he even though it was small stakes, he was against a whole bunch of players who were actually quite good. And of course, this way of playing with these simpler algorithmic strategies made the games less fun for the recreational players. They only played good, his opponents only played very good hands. Mm-hmm. And in the long run, I think that hurt poker a great deal. So the idea that the poker sites, they realize this, and so they're cutting back on the amount of multi-tabling. I think it's very good. And if you can force, if you wave a magic wand, what you'd want to do is you would want to force these professional type players, all of them, out of these very small games. Make them play less games, but at higher stakes. And then as players in the smaller games, some of them did well, perhaps by luck, they would go take shots at the higher games. And that's the way the poker ecosystem used to be. And that's a lot of that's lost today.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's probably also... Yeah, go ahead.
No, just go on. Then to make it worse, No Limit Hold'em became the most popular game. And that gives these expert players a little even bigger... Their edge becomes too big over these recreational players. So the games start to choke themselves off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. Well, I wanted to zoom in a bit on what you were saying. For example, PokerStars getting rid of the Supernova Elite and that type of reward system. So I understand, are quite in favor of that. Them reducing the number of tables available. I think we both agree that that's a great thing, and for the good of the industry. Currently they are working on trying to make the games a bit more fun by experimenting with introducing antes into the games and doing all such things. But what I'm seeing in the industry, and I want to hear your opinion on what's going on, but from what I see is, for example, PokerStars are trying to innovate in some ways. They're getting a lot of resistance from the professional poker players, because obviously we are always resistant to change, and any change is bad, and we always perceive that, these guys have their monetary motives behind it. They just want to increase the rake, they want to increase their profit. So many of us are not willing to listen to the propositions. And at the same time, we see that PokerStars themselves are facing quite a lot of pressure from loosely regulated or not regulated sites, which are stealing a lot of the business. So the company itself has to fight against some of the operators that are operating under a questionable license. And while fighting against these competitors, they also are trying to preserve or improve the ecosystem of poker by changing something. It seems like a very tough strategy, very tough situation for a site like PokerStars at the moment.
Okay, let's. I think you have a couple of different issues there. Let's try to take them one at a time. The first question is, what's the characteristic that an ideal poker game would have? Well, one of the characteristics, and this will sound a little bit vague, is what I call a proper balance of luck and skill. And what that means is there's enough luck in the game, so the recreational players will have some winning nights. That'll keep them coming back. And there's enough skill in the game so that the more expert type players, at the end of the year or 6 months or whatever the time period is, will be pretty sure that they'll be winners. And if you get that out of balance, the games will have trouble. And with No Limit Hold'em, it got out of balance towards the skill side. No Limit, I think it was an unfortunate thing. It was actually good for our company because we got to put out No Limit Hold'em books. But No Limit Hold'em as a tournament game works pretty well. And that's because the stakes every now and then go up. And that every time you raise the stakes, you introduce some more luck into the game. So that creates a reasonably good balance of luck and skill. Of course, if you raise the stakes like every 2 minutes, you probably have too much luck in it. If you would only raise the stakes like once every 5 or 6 hours, you probably don't have enough luck in it. But No Limit Hold'em tournaments work pretty well. And since that was the game that was being featured on TV, people began to want to play No Limit Hold'em as a cash game. Well, also in the tournaments, they add antes to it, which increases the luck factor some. And in the cash games, you just had 2 blinds. And people could make larger buy-ins. And what happened there was the balance of luck and skill got completely out of whack in favor of the skill. So if you're an expert No Limit Hold'em player and you can play with a couple of bad players in your game, you would never want to change it because you just have too big of an edge. And you'll have very few, losing days and nights and so on. But what happens is, and I think this is exactly what happened, was the recreational players just all got wiped out. And that was making the games tougher and tougher over time. And when that happens, the expert players, they're not really expert anymore because you only are expert relative to your competition. So the expert players just became sort of the regular type players with, at best, a very small edge, and then they began to struggle. Now, there's other issues here. One we've mentioned already is the Rake. I mean, my opinion, a lot of the bonuses should be done away with, and the Rake should be lowered. And but it's been sort of shown pretty conclusively that a lot of players like bonuses. That's why jackpot poker games became popular, where people would get aces full beat, and they would, win a jackpot. That was an attraction to the game. I know in casino games, this is based more on observation and a few conversations I've had with people. When the house edge gets much above 1.5%, people quit playing unless there's a jackpot. The jackpot's added to the game that they can go to 3% a lot of times. A house edge. So that's one of the things that attracts people. So that's the first issue. There's an interesting example related to the first issue, which I talk about every now and then. And it's this idea, again, balancing luck and skill. As the stakes get higher, players tend to get better. So, the best 10, 20 no-limit hold'em players they are usually a lot better than the best 2-5 no-limit hold'em players. And in the game of 7-card stud, which is hardly played anymore, so it's a real shame, there was something that was done that solved that problem, and it was the ante. In 1530 card stud, there was a $2 ante, and in 75 150 stud, there was a $3 ante. Well, there was a $15 ante. Well, a $15 ante at 75 150 was the equivalent of a $3 ante at 1530. But when you looked at the stud games, which used to be fairly common, the very best 1530 players were nowhere near as good as the best 75 150 players. Stud is a game where the ability to increase skill up and up and up is really there, much more so than in Hold'em. But what this larger ante did was it helped the recreational player. So by chance, and I guess evolution, the games evolved like this, and it kept the balance, the luck and skill sort of intact. In other words, at the 1530 game with a $2 ante, you had a certain balance of luck and skill. At the 75 150 game with the $15 ante, which is equivalent to the $3 ante at 1530, you still had that balance of luck and skill, even though the skilled players were better, because the higher ante helped the poor players. And what that did was it kept the games going all the time. And then, the TV shows came along with Hold'em and wiped everything out. But I remember, in Las Vegas, smaller limit stud games went all the time, and high stakes stud games just went all the time. They'd go around the clock. And part of the reason for that was, I like to call them tourist type. A tourist type player in a small stud game didn't really play any better. Or excuse me, the tourist type player in the large stud game didn't play any better than the tourist type player in the small stud game. The problem was, in the large stud game, he was against people who were more expert than in the smaller stud game. But that was made up for by the ante. I'm not sure how that affects Hold'em, though. But I would suspect that adding antes to Hold'em, especially at higher limits, might help bring the balance of luck and skill back. On the other hand, if you're not getting any recreational players into these higher stakes, no limit Hold'em games, it won't matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So I think that was the first point you brought up. The second point were these kind of semi-regulated or non-regulated card rooms that are coming. And some of them have these agents that collect the money, and I don't know much about them. And then they redistribute the money if you win, I guess. And probably, most of them are probably fairly honest, but there's always the potential. The less regulation there is there's potential for things to go wrong. And my guess is things eventually, at least in one place, will go wrong. And the reason you can say that is things have gone wrong in places that were more regulated. Mm. So, if I was trying to play one of those card rooms, I wouldn't put a lot of money on the side, and I would see how I did in the games. If I was winning in the games and could withdraw without much problems, probably would keep playing.
What do you think would benefit the industry more, having one strong operator or several strong operators?
I think several strong operators. I think competition is always good. That creates innovation, and it will also help keep the rakes down.
Mm-hmm.
And on a similar sort of line, I lived in California in the early 1980s, and the everything there was a time charge. Time charges there were very high. And then I came to Las Vegas in 1987, and the rakes and time charges in Las Vegas were, at least at that time, were much lower. And that's what everybody said, and it wasn't true. Back in California, they had what they called a prop system. Prop was short for proposition player. And these were people who were basically paid by the house to play poker. So the amount of money that was collected off a table that the house would take was virtually about the same that the amount of money that was being collected in Las Vegas. It's just what was happening in California was some players were paying, let's say, double or triple rake, and other players were being paid to play. Mm-hmm. So these things work out in different ways, and I think that has a lot to do with the competition. Right now, I really think right now that the biggest danger to these games is the rake. Just a personal opinion. But the rakes have been pushed up so much that I remember when I first started playing, this was in California, and at that time only forms of draw poker were legal, but I would play in a 3-6 draw poker game and pay 50 cents every 30 minutes to play. Well, at that rate, it gave me a chance to learn something about how to play the game and how to become a player. Today, in similar games, they take as much as $7 or $8 out of a pot. Mm. Some goes to the jackpot and other prizes, and a lot goes to the house. I mean, it's just killing these games.
Mm. Yeah, I agree that the rake is, well, several things, because the biggest problem, of course, is that if the recreational players are gone, right, and what slowly draws them away from the game is, well, there's less fun because the combination of skill and luck is skewed too much to skill, and they stand no chance. There's no fun in losing 13 sessions in a row or 50 sessions in a row or whatever it is.
There's no fun in losing one session.
Well, yeah, but obviously, but especially if you get the feeling that you have no chance, then that's pretty much end of that story. Another thing that, because in live games, I often see in some really, really big, interesting games die out just because, especially in the earlier days when people were reluctant to run it twice and they were just increasing the variance, very often the game just, instead of continuing for several years, it just dies out real quick because, well, some people get hurt really bad, real early, and that's it. But coming back to, because I went off track here, I wanted to actually address this, which I find really interesting that you mentioned, that the proper game, the good game, is supposed to have a good balance between the luck and skill. And you said that No Limit Hold'em has this in the tournament setting, which I agree. And as a tournament game, it's great. But the problem that we're recently seeing is these, whatever it is, sometimes 10, 15 day one rebuy opportunities for people, which skews the whole equation back to skill. Because if the top professional can rebuy 10, 15 times in tournament,
that's absolutely correct. When you work the math out, it often is correct to rebuy. And when you can rebuy, it allows you to use a more aggressive / reckless type strategy in the hopes of accumulating chips. So if I'm a player, I'm a recreational player, and I show up at the tournament with one buy-in, and you're somebody who's willing to rebuy 10 times, just that gives you an edge over me.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think it's so severe that the recreational players who play these things and they don't really have the ability to rebuy or don't want to rebuy, probably shouldn't be playing them. I think it's a big mistake. I think what the tournament should do is just go to a larger entry fee and not have a rebuy.
Yeah, I agree with that. Even though I don't really play tournaments, I don't enjoy the format, but I follow what's happening in that field because I feel like regardless, a lot of new players come in first as a tournament player or to experience the rush of the tournament, and then they trickle down to the cash games and such. So it's important to me what's happening in the tournament scene, as it should for every cash game player.
I think that's absolutely right. They see the poker shows and they're featuring tournaments mainly, or mostly, not all the time, but most of them, and then that's what attracts them.
Yeah, and my concern is that what we're seeing right now with these multiple day 1A or day one entries, rather, which we both agree that that's not a good thing for poker long term, but it's partly driven because of this increased competition between the major, whatever we call it, the major three sites right now.
Well, let me interrupt this a little bit. It used to be that you entered a tournament and you paid an additional fee to enter the tournament, and then you could rebuy. When you made your rebuy, there was no additional fee. Now they're re-entries, and in the re-entries, I think you're paying your additional fee every time.
Yeah.
That makes these tournaments, at least in the short run, much more profitable for the tournament host. I think that's one of the issues that's come up here, is that they realize that when players are willing to re-entry multiple times, they've made more money.
Yeah. Well, that's one part of it. And the second part, it allows them to advertise higher guarantees, because now they can say, hey, our tournament is $1 million, $2 million, $5 million guaranteed tournament. Not because they have so many unique players, it's just because they know that a bunch of professionals are going to buy in 10 times if they have to.
Right. That's absolutely right. And anyone who knows the business, when tournaments don't hit their guarantees, those tournaments usually are not offered anymore. They very quickly disappear, or at least they lower the guarantees. So the guarantee number, which sounds really good, is really a little bit false, because again, this gets back to the idea of gambling. Is the tournament provider gambling when they offer a guarantee? Well, they have very good data and evidence that they're going to meet this guarantee. So when that's the case, there's not much of a luck factor, and they're not gambling. But if it turns out they don't meet the guarantee, they quit offering it.
Yeah, well, but nowadays you see that the guarantees keep rising and rising and rising. Every year we break a record. Every quarter it seems like we break a record. Hey, that's the biggest guarantee ever. That's the biggest series with the biggest guarantee. All of the time you see this in marketing. The question is it really a poker boom right now? Why are we seeing this increase in guarantees? Well, it's clearly because of the way that they offer the product with the multiple re-entries, etc., etc. And on top of that, if they don't hit the guarantee in some of the tournaments, and we've seen a lot of tournaments go with an overlay recently, nobody talks much about it, and the poker sites see it as a marketing expense. Well, we wasted some money on advertising that, hey, we are the biggest site, we have the biggest guarantee.
Well, if that's the case, that they're looking at a bigger picture, and they're saying, well, this is just an advertising cost, and it's benefiting our business, in other ways. There's a number of things that have happened which really surprised me. I think it's just just showing my age, but you now have these $100,000 buy-in tournaments are fairly common, and you have higher buy-in tournaments. I mean, I never would have thought that anything like that would have ever happened. And you have these very, very wealthy people who want to play tournaments. Now, when I was much younger, you did have very, very wealthy people showing up playing huge cash games. That doesn't seem to be happening as much anymore. I do hear in Macau those games exist, but now they're showing up and they want to play these tournaments.
Well, those games still exist. They're not abundant, but I don't think they were ever abundant. They were always sort of a limited amount of them available. The unfortunate fact is that most of these games are private.
That's true.
And that's really bad because, again, we come to the same fact of, would you rather play a highly regulated site where you can put a lot of trust in everything is clean and nice, or do you put trust in the host of the game, especially if the game is held outside casino? Because, of course, there are plenty of private games held in the casino, which is a much safer environment. But
and another thing that's happened, which has surprised me, is in these very, very ultra high buy-in tournaments, you have good tournament players showing up, and now this is spread to lower stakes where they sell pieces of themselves at markups. So you get a guy who, in some cases, is playing these things almost for free because of the markups, and I don't know. Just things evolve, I guess. And
yeah, well, things definitely evolved, and not only in terms
I'm not sure that's long-term good.
Yeah, it's questionable. I mean, I don't know what's the answer, especially when it comes to people selling pieces. I see the benefits of that for the poker economy, and I see the drawbacks of it. The bigger question is, how is it perceived by people getting into the game, right? Because if we think about back in the day when the poker boom started with Chris Moneymaker, for example, right?
Let me interrupt you there, because you made a very good point. You said, how is it perceived by players getting in the game? In my opinion, most players who are getting in the game are unaware of this stuff. If they were aware of it, I don't know if they'd get in the game. I mean, if you knew that the players at your table, we're all pieced out and doing things, that you might not understand the implications of that, but you would think there's got to be something wrong with that. Why am I paying this all myself? And they're not. So, of course, once they begin to find out about it, in some cases they become poker players and then they want to take part in it as well. But so I actually think that it is negative. I think it. Players, I think as players find out about it, it stops some of them from playing.
And they will find out about it because, I mean, everybody's talking openly about it because, I mean, not many people perceive it as something bad, especially in the tournament scene. Everybody's openly talking about these things. So, like you said, some people are getting the wake-up call pretty early. They come in for their first World Series of Poker or something like that, first time, and they get to hear these things, and they might not understand what it implies, because it's not all bad, but the way the people perceive it. Because the concern is, when somebody gets into the game, how long do they stay in the game? Is it like a short excursion? Okay, I play 1-2 tournaments, I'm disillusioned, I hate this scene, and I'm not getting back? Or are they staying longer? Because the same thing happens with, when you play, let's say, these online tournaments, and you lose your one bullet, and then you check the results and you see, oh, you know what, everybody on the final table bought in like 5 or 7 times. That gets you thinking.
Right. You may not understand how it works exactly and what all the implications of it are, but you know that something just isn't quite right. Why are all these people buying in 5 or 7 times? I've only bought in once. And then I had dinner with a friend who came into town the other night who's playing some of the World Series of Poker tournaments on the internet. And he made almost that same point to me. He said, I have to play tight and solid, and these people are playing wild. And because I'm only going to buy in once, they're buying in numerous times, and they have an edge on me. You know, they hit a couple of hands, they build a chip stack, and, you know, it makes it very tough to play. Yeah. I think people realize that. So I think all these things need to be looked at and all their implications.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are actually publicly and actively talking about this, especially people from the tournament scene. And that's great to see that people are outspoken, and hopefully there's going to be change, because it really does seem like this is not sustainable. Especially also the deceptive fact that you earlier were talking about how in the stud environment, for example, that the players at the higher stakes are going to be much better than the players at the lower stakes, and they don't usually drop down at the lower stakes. And with the online, with the multi-tabling, all of a sudden it became interesting to play lower stakes because you can just play 10 times amount of hands per hour. Right? But the same thing is happening with these tournaments. You know, if we think about a €1,000 or $1,000 tournament, unless there was this huge guarantee and unless there was a chance to rebuy multiple times, some of the bigger pros, they would not play that tournament. It's just not worth it for them in terms of expectations. But because of the high guarantees, et cetera, they're all over the place.
Well, obviously, you know, I mean, from that pro's point of view, he's trying to maximize his expectation. That's what a good poker player does, and that's, you know, what a knowledgeable gambler does. And the reason he's making the decisions that he's making is he believes that those are the decisions that maximize his expectation. And I think probably in most cases that they're correct. Mm-hmm. So that's why they do that. If it was negative to rebuy, and in other words, if it hurt your expectations to rebuy, they wouldn't do it. I remember when rebuys really first started, this is probably early 80s, people thought it was a sucker play. I remember reading articles about how foolish it was to rebuy. And because that wasn't true. Just the opposite was true. And, you know, that's what happens. So I don't blame these pros for doing that. Because as a pro expert, you're supposed to maximize your expectation. But manager types, and this is where we get back into how probability theory works and variance and all that's how it's counterintuitive. Manager types in most cases don't really understand this. The expert players, even if they don't theoretically understand it well, at least intuitively understand it well. They know that through experience, that being willing to make rebuys, they've done better in the long run. A lot of these management types, you know, there's a reason they're management types, and that's because a lot of them are failed poker players. So they don't understand any of this. If they understood a lot of it, I think they would stop it.
Yeah.
And there's going to be some managers out there who are not going to be happy with those remarks, but
yeah, well, I mean, that's always the case. But if things need to change, and they need to change, and a lot of people are talking about it, well, yeah, there's going to be a lot of unhappy people, and on both sides, there's going to be unhappy managers. There's going to be unhappy poker players who are going to say, "Hey, you're trying to, you know, I'm making so much money. You're trying to take this away from me." Well,
you're starting to touch on an idea that I think is important. Very often, what happens is a manager type, and this just could be a manager of a poker room or maybe a tournament director or something. They'll call in a group of players to talk to, and what I believe often happens is if you call in 10 poker players to talk to, they're going to tell you 10 different things. And each one is telling you what he thinks is best for him. And they really think about what's best for poker in the long run. And I know I've had a couple of discussions with poker room managers in Las Vegas. There's a little, this is very minor for this discussion, but there's a little rule that a lot of poker rooms have right now called must move games. Mm-hmm. I think they're one of the worst things poker rooms can do. And I've had conversations with a couple of poker room managers. And they said to me, well, some of the players like the must move game and some of the players don't like the must move game. And in each case, I said to the manager, I said, but you're the manager. You're supposed to know what's best. And you're supposed to know why that is. And you don't really have any conception. And I think that those comments of mine, while they're a little bit rude, I think that actually carries over to a lot of these other things. They call in players and they get all sorts of different points of view. And they don't really understand very well the underlying statistical theory and what is actually driving this stuff. And they really kind of don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. So since this other site is now advertising that they have the biggest guarantee ever, the original site now wants to have something that has an even bigger guarantee. The fact that they might both be hurting each other is not well understood.
Mm-hmm. I want to touch upon this must-move game, though. I'm not sure that people want to hear this, but I personally want to talk about it because I have an opinion on that. Because I used to play. Well, now with this virus situation, obviously, I'm not traveling for poker that much, but I used to play quite a big portion of a year in the live games, including in some of the card rooms in Las Vegas. So I am in the environment where the must-move games are all of the time. But you said you don't like them. Can you tell me why?
Well, what I've seen happen over and over again. We started this interview at 10 a.m. my time. And because of the virus, I changed my schedule to a day schedule. But I used to be someone who would sleep to at least noon, and then I'd be up all night. And what we'd constantly see with must-move games was the must-move game would go short and break. And when it would break, you would then create a list. And my experience from playing live poker for many years, I almost take this, it's like 40 years, is every so often, and sometimes fairly often, late at night, players would walk in from the pit and they'd want to play poker. And they have very little conception of how to play poker. And these players, before all these must-move games, they would sit down in an empty seat and be major contributors to the game. Well, now because of the must-move list games, they break the must-move game. Now this player walks in from the pit and he's told there's 5 names ahead of him. So or 3 names ahead of him, whatever it is. So he walks out. So these poker rooms have created a situation where they're not only hurting the players who are playing, they're hurting themselves because now instead of having 2 games, they only have 1 game. So they collect less rake. Players who we would call big producers now can't get into games. And you have a lot of marginal players who are playing, who want to play regularly. So when a big producer sits down and loses money, these marginal players get some of it. And now they have enough money on other days to help start games and keep games going. Now they're running short. They can't do that. So I've always found it to be very detrimental to poker rooms. And my experience is when I've tried to talk to poker room managers about this, they don't even they have very little understanding what I'm even talking about.
Mm-hmm.
They say to me, well, we want the must-move game to keep the main game full. Well, in my opinion, the best game always has an open seat. And the reason for that is you never know who will walk in, playing live anyway, who will walk in and sit down in that game. And every now and then it'll be a very, very desirable player.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, from my perspective, and I see your point, and it is bad that we lose these people coming in and they see, oh, there's no game, there's a waiting list, so I'm just not going to bother. That's a bad result, because we all know that they're going to end up at the blackjack table or somewhere else.
Let me tell a little story. This happened to me back in the 80s. I used to play in a Raz game that was in town. And usually it was a 15-30 Raz game. And I remember one night I was playing, and a tourist walked into the room, and he went up to the floor person and he said, I want to play poker. And the floor person said, well, the only game we have an open seat right now is Raz. He said, it's almost word for word. He said, it's 7-card stud, but it's played low, and straights and flushes don't count. And the guy's answer was, I know how to play 7-card stud. What's a straight or flush? So, well, if you have your must-move games, you're going to lose those people. And that's, it is a predatory world of the poker. When you lose those people, you're hurting it.
You know what happens very often, I feel like, without the must-move? It's hard to get the game going, right? Because I'm usually one of the people who starts the game. Let's say we go to Bellagio. I like to play in the morning or the midday. So you show up in Bellagio and there's a group of 4 or 5 people. We start the game. Sometimes it's 4 or 5 people, 6 people for a couple hours. Then the game fills up. It's usually, the first game is usually not that great. Everybody knows that. We're just keeping it alive.
That's another problem.
That's another problem, right? The thing is, we know that, okay, we filled that table up, and there's going to be some players who are not really strong, but they're not really what you call a producer, right?
Okay.
But the hope is that eventually the must move is going to start, and then the game, our main game, is going to gradually improve over time. And it's just beneficial for example, for myself to be in a position where I know I'm going to be in that game. Whereas if we don't have the must move, very often what can happen, and it does happen, so that mediocre game still fills up and we're all playing the mediocre table. And then a true recreational player, the guy that we were all waiting for, we knew that he's coming today. We didn't know if he's coming in the next 2 hours or 5 hours. He shows up and he's on the other table now. Now, the problem is I've been playing for 5 hours, keeping this crappy game alive. I want to play that game, but I can't, because how am I going to, what am I going to be on the waiting list for the same stakes game while playing this game? That's doesn't seem right.
You're confusing me.
Quit my game?
If you're in the main game and there's a must-move game, you can't move to the must.
No. But that's what I'm saying. If there's no must-move game, so there's another game starting, right? So there is no must-move. If we imagine that situation, we kept the crappy game alive, and now all of a sudden a great game starts, but I can't get in anymore, and they're not moving to my table because there's no must-move.
Why can't you? If there's no must-move, why can't you transfer to the great game?
Well, that's the problem, you see, because all the politics starts. Because as soon as that player comes in, because anyway, what happens is, like, I can describe to you a situation, for example. We would be playing, let's say we're playing 50-100 PLO in Bellagio, right? We're playing that game, everybody's happy. Then somebody special walks in.
Okay.
The first thing that's going to happen is we call the floor manager, or we run to the floor manager, hoping that we're not in the hand. Sometimes just fold the hand outright, just run there. We want to be first on the waiting list for every game, 100, 200, 300, 600, whatever. So there's a lot of joking happening. Who gets the first seat, etc., etc. And when a situation like this arises, well, then it's pretty much as unfortunately, it comes down to who's paying better tips to the floor manager, in a way, because who gets the favor, and you see it in a lot of poker rooms.
I understand exactly what you're saying, and it happens at all stakes. It's not just very, very high stakes games. It can happen at lower stakes games too. I've always been in favor, or I always thought that, so I think all these systems are flawed a little bit, but I always thought that the best system was balanced games with emphasis on the main game. In other words, if you start a second game, you try to keep the same number of people in each game. So let's say you have a main game, it fills up, and it's 9-handed. And then a second game starts, that's 5-handed. Well, 9 and 5 is 14. And if you divide that by 2, you have 7. So now you would really like to have 7 people per game. So you don't force people to transfer out of the main game where the emphasis is. But if 2 of them do want to transfer to the other game, you now have 7 people in each game. Mm-hmm. Now, if the 2 games are balanced and somebody walks in from the pit, he goes to the game that's been designated to have the emphasis. So it could be either game. It depends, what they decide. So somebody walks in from the pit. The 2 games are 7-handed. He has to go into the. He has to go into. We call them game number 1 and game number 2. Game number 1 has the emphasis, so he'd have to go into game number 1. So game number 1 now would be 8-handed. Game number 2 would be 7-handed. Then if somebody else now comes in, he would have to go to game number 2 to keep the 2 games balanced. Mm-hmm. Now you can transfer too. So if if you're in a game with 9-handed and the other game is 7-handed, you could transfer, and that would rebalance the games at 8-handed each. I always felt that was a better system. Part of the problem with that system is it's a little more complicated for floor people.
Yeah.
And they have to keep track of, who's on the transfer list and that stuff. And a lot of times they don't like to do that.
Mm. Well, I can't blame them, really, because they already have a lot of things to do. But at the same time, that also opens up an opportunity for some people to exploit it in a way that, because, you mentioned the example of there's 5 people at one table, 7 people at the other table. The 5 people at the first or the second table are not, there's no recreational player there, so nobody wants to switch. As soon as that next guy comes up, all of a sudden everybody wants to switch, and then there's a lot of joking, a lot of shouting, and why does he always switch? Why does he always, all of these things.
You have the transfer list established first. Just because there's a transfer list doesn't mean you can switch until the games become unbalanced.
Right, but you know how that works. There's always room for jumping ahead in the list. There's always all of these things. It just.
I understand all that, but I still think that's a better system than the must-move games they have. Because at least in this system, when the producer walks in, he can play. He's not told there's a list and he'll leave. And from the house's point of view, they keep more games going. Mm-hmm. I think that those 2 facts outweigh the other issues that you're bringing up, but you're certainly right what you're saying.
What's your opinion about the private games held within the casino? You know what I'm referring to, that basically, people would come in with their private list and they say, hey, these are the people who are playing the game. Let's say we start a game 9-handed. This is the list of 5 people who are going to be first on the list. And then it's an open list after that. And obviously goes without saying, that list is nobody's going to get into that game apart from these people.
Well, my understanding is that according to the Nevada gaming regulations, that's not legal, even though it's done. And I don't think it should be allowed. I mean, if a poker room is offering a game, they really shouldn't make the game private. I mean, sometimes you've had like it's tricky. I mean, sometimes you might have like a group of people come in and they're all on their Vegas vacation together and they want to play a poker game. And they all like to play with each other. So maybe you allow it for that. But I know what you're talking about. You're talking about high stakes games where certain players are just literally not allowed to play.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not right. So at least that's my opinion. And I also understand that's not legal either.
Yeah, that's the thing. It is not legal. Obviously, they find a way to do it as a loophole. And I mean, I've played some of those games, right? So I'm not always on the end of not being able to get into them, but I still hate the system. And that being said, while I hate the system, I know why the demand for the private game is there, because certain people only want to play in a certain kind of game. They want to have fun. They want to have a good conversation. They want to have a few drinks. They don't want, a lot of specific
That's what's
type of
going
people.
on. And, in some of these cases, you have a guy who, while he's playing poker, is also a big customer out in the casino pit for blackjack or baccarat or dice or whatever. Casinos try to keep those people happy.
Yeah.
I've been in games, I bet you have too, where there's a long list and a certain player walks in and he gets right in the game.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, of course. And everybody's happy to get him into the game. Well, anyway, we're getting...
You're not so happy. You're not so happy if you're one of the people on the list waiting for it.
Oh, yeah. Well, that goes without saying, because they're all going to cry about, well, what happened to the must-move table? Why don't we open another game? Why does this not happen, et cetera, et cetera? It's always the case, yeah. Mason, you know what I want to ask you about? Because we've been talking a lot about what's happening in the industry and the perception that the people have, the perception that the pros have of what the sites are doing, what the managers of the sites are doing, what do they think, what do the recreational players think. And 2+2, the forums that you have and the material that you bring out to people is basically the information source for the poker players, for recreationals and professionals, and everybody working in the industry. Can you talk me through a bit more? How did this come about? Maybe how did the company start, and what are you doing right now, and what is the goal with this?
Answer your last question is I don't believe in goals.
Okay.
We can get to that at the end. It's actually an interesting story. I worked for the United States Census Bureau, and for the 1980s, the Census Bureau, this is the way it used to be, is sort of a small government agency that every 10 years would hire 250,000 people to do the census, the decennial census. So I got sent out west, and on my way out west, I stopped in Las Vegas and was immediately fascinated with the games. And I moved to Southern California and discovered that forms of poker were legal, and also like blackjack. And I have an academic background, so I would read and study things. So I began to buy books, and I began to have some ideas of my own. And I had an idea about blackjack, which today is known as shuffle tracking. I called it card domination. And one day I was reading one of these blackjack books. It was called Blackjack's Winning Formula by a man named Jerry Patterson. And he wrote something that sort of hinted at the ideas that I had. So I wrote him, and I heard back from him. And just by coincidence, he was going to be giving a seminar the following week at a hotel that was about mile and a half from where I lived. So he invited me to come meet with him. So I went and met with him, and after his little seminar where he was trying to, attract students, we talked and we went over all this stuff. And it was very clear that I knew a lot more about it than he did. And so he started telling me that things like, you could become part of my blackjack team, and I could help you get bankrolled, all that kind of stuff. And he asked me if I would write up my ideas and send them to him. So I did all that. Of course, I never heard from him again. And after a few months, I realized that he was probably going to steal my ideas and it'd all be in his next book. Mm-hmm. So I knew about a magazine at that time called Gambling Times. So I wrote it up and I submitted it to Gambling Times magazine. And it took them a while, but in August of 1983, they published my first article, which was called Card Domination. I don't know what it was called. Anyway, Card Domination was part of the title. And they paid me $150 for this article. It's pretty good, especially since it was kind of fun to write up. And by then I had a whole bunch of other ideas about poker and blackjack. So I began to write for them. And they also had at that time a little newspaper called Poker Player, which they distributed in the card rooms, and they'd pay me for that. So I was working. Well, by now I had left the Census Bureau and I'd gone to work for Northrop Corporation. So I go to Northrop and I write these articles while sitting at my desk and submit them, and I would get paid. It was pretty good. And I had, through doing this stuff, I'd become friends with Mike Caro, who was kind of a big name in poker at the time. And so we went down to Gambling Times magazine offices, which were in Hollywood, Florida. And we met with a man named Stanley Sudikoff, who was the publisher and majority owner. And I ended up signing a contract with him to do a book. Now, this was in 1985. Well, by 1987, Gambling Times had gone bankrupt, and they'd never published my book. So I had to hire an attorney and wrestle the book back. And so that put me not only in the writing business on poker and other forms of gambling, but it now put me in the publishing business because I self-published the book. So it is kind of interesting. I had two events happen to me, which when they happened to me, I was very, very unhappy about. And with hindsight, I realized they're the best things that ever could have happened to me. So 1987, I self-published 3 books. I was now in the publishing business. And during this time period, I'd become friends with David Sklansky. So he wanted to do a book in 1988, which was called Hold'em Poker, which we called Hold'em Poker for Advanced Players. So we wrote that, and then the next year we wrote 7-Card Stud for Advanced Players. And then David had 4 other books which had been published by different publishers who all went out of business or stopped publishing. Mm-hmm. And in 1989, he got the rights to those books back. One of those books was called Winning Poker at the time. And after that, we changed the title to The Theory of Poker. And we revamped it some. So David wanted me to take over all these books. So in 1989, all of a sudden, I was publisher of 9 books. So that's really how the publishing company worked. And I kept writing too. And then in 1996, I had a young lady at the time who had some marketing experience, who was trying to help me with some marketing so we could have more book sales. And we had been accepted in 1996 by both Borders and Barnes & Noble. They both agreed to carry our books. And Borders is gone today, but they were a huge bookstore chain at the time. Barnes & Noble is still around. And I still have my initial letter from Barnes & Noble where they wanted to buy 10 copies of one of our books. They had 500 stores. So we quickly realized that if you call them up and said, and you can get a book buyer on the phone, which was hard to do. If you call them up and said, look, we have the best books in our field. You should carry them in all your stores. The answer you would get is, well, every publisher says that. So it was suggested to me by her name is Jessica Vecchione, but she suggested to me that we get on the internet and try to set up what was called a bulletin board. And a bulletin board, it was a forum, and we could have people join us and we could discuss, poker topics on the forum. And then we could go back to these big bookstore chains and say, look, we have a following, just look here. So in 1997, I knew somebody who knew how to do this. So we set up 2+2.com, and we began with one forum, and we thought that it was like 50-50 we'd get a post. And so today we're like 60 million posts later. Mm-hmm. And that's basically how the company began. And people would send me manuscripts on the publishing side, and I would look at them, and we accepted, some of them, and for publication, we'd work on them. And that's really been the way we operated. And the website sort of operates itself. I actually, I post on there, but I really don't do that much with it. Mm-hmm. Today there's over 100 forums, and we also have a Internet Poker Magazine, and we used to have a podcast, which we don't have anymore. But the podcast I think it did 499 shows, so wow. It was very popular at one time. And we just, at least for a while there, we really became a center for everything poker. It's now much more fragmented. Other groups have come along and competed with us and other topics, but it's still a very successful website. So that's basically our story. We kind of, I think I've told this to a lot of people that if you ever had some expert come in and he wanted to review the history of our company, he would look at this and he'd say, well, wow, you made this very good decision here, and you made this very good decision there. And the reality is we just blundered into things. Mm-hmm. Just, like, for example, we started getting, on our poker forum, we started getting posts that didn't really have that much to do with poker strategy. So we said, all right, we'll just start our second forum. So then we had two forums. We had the original forum and then something called Other Topics. And it just kept splitting from there. And that's kind of the way it began. And we did some things I think helped it grow. The idea was vigorous debate and a little bit of fun, and we tried to keep the insults down, which is hard to do. And I don't know, we just by accident hit the right formula that really grew. Yeah. And then the poker boom came along. When the poker boom came along, we were just people who were in the right place at the right time with a pretty good product. So
yeah, and I think you really contributed to the poker boom in a way, because I remember the first time I started seriously considering playing poker, the first thing I did was buy Dan Harrington's book, or both of them, or three books even. There was 2 books, and then the practical part. Yeah. And that was my introduction to poker in many ways.
Those books were a sensation. Harrington and Hold'em Volume 1 came out in December of 2004. And the poker boom had begun about a year and a half earlier. Mm-hmm. And some named players had put out stuff, wasn't very good. And when these books came along, people were really stunned as to how good they were.
Oh, yeah.
So we had huge sales. And, Dan, who was a great player anyway, became like a legendary name. Mm-hmm. And his co-author, Bill Roberti, is a very, very capable person. So between the two of them, they produced quite a manuscript. I remember going over to California to meet with them a number of times. We'd go over where the comics should go and try to challenge them on every concept just to make it better. Books just came out great.
Oh yeah, that was an incredible book.
That was a huge boost to our company too. We were already very, very successful, and then we had this huge boost came along.
And why did you stop the podcast? You said you did over 400 episodes, and why
did 499? Well, we had sponsorship for a long time. It was mostly PokerStar sponsorship, and then they went through changes, and so they dropped the sponsorship, and we supported it for a while without sponsorship, and then just decided we didn't really want to support it anymore. And one of the original hosts had already retired. That was Mike Johnson, who was very, very good. And the other host had told us that he just didn't have the kind of time that he used to have. So we just said, well, all good things must pass. So we just ended it.
I see. The reason I was asking, actually, because I feel like there are a lot of changes right now going on in the industry from so many aspects. I mean, we obviously already talked about, what the sites are doing, how the economy seems to be changing, the poker economy, that is, but also the availability of material out there, right? We just talked about the fantastic book by Dan Harrington, which was one of the kind back in its day. Right. And nowadays we're spoiled for information. Any game you want to play, there are coaches out there, there's sites offering material. Some of it is better than other, but that's always the case. Right. But pretty much abundance of information, abundance of podcasts, abundance of everything.
Well, the poker boom began in I guess May of 2003. It's when the original World Poker Tour shows got on TV, and all of a sudden our book sales went crazy. And then a couple of months later, Moneymaker wins the World Series of Poker. And that was, a lot of people think the boom began with Moneymaker. It really didn't. It began before him. But when he won the World Series of Poker, it was like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Oh, yeah.
And at that time, there was really a shortage of poker books and information. So anyone who had put out a poker book all of a sudden saw, very good sales. And then, a couple of years later, some of the first, I guess, video training sites showed up. And we made a decision not to compete with them, but to let them on our site. So we had all, a lot of them would advertise. So we've all acted. So we contributed to some of that. And I should say today there's, a number of these type of sites, and there's all these coaches out there. And so it's become very, in that sense, it's become very fragmented. There's really not just one or two central sources you go to. But, we're still around, and we still have our books, and we still have a lot of discussion, on our website.
Yeah. And that is the key, because that's something that is unlikely to change, as fragmented as it is. But still, if you are looking for unbiased information about what's going on in the poker world, you're probably first looking into the forums. I mean, there's a lot of bias, of course, but at least it's not filtered in a way that, there's going to be just one-sided opinion pushed by some marketing agenda.
Well, we have an advantage. We've been so successful as a company. I mean, we're not really beholden to any advertiser. I mean, advertiser doesn't like what's appeared on the forum. If it's something that, of an insulting nature, we'll take it down.
Mm.
If it's with an opinion that says that, their poker side or their book or whatever, isn't that good, or their coaching isn't that good, it stays up. We are concerned that sometimes people will put things up and they'll say that this person is a scammer. We get a little bit concerned about that because it just could be someone who doesn't like that person.
Mm-hmm.
But so we do try to watch that stuff a little bit more closely.
Yeah, interesting. I'm just curious on how and what is going to happen to the industry, because the problems that we discussed persist. There are a lot of people trying to change things. It looks good. I'm overall quite optimistic about what's going to happen, but I'm pretty sure we're going to see some changes.
Well, we've already gone over this, but one, they have to lower the rake, and two, they have to do appropriate things to get the pros out of these lower limit games, and create a better environment at the small stakes for the recreational players. I think those are the two big things.
Mm.
And so the multi-tabling is reducing that is a step in that direction. Things like the multiple re-entries into a tournaments are probably something that has to be looked at, and
yeah, absolutely,
and it probably reduced. And and so on. And again, I just think it has to go back to people have to get a better understanding as to how all this works. And again, things based on probability theory, and poker is a game based on probability theory, are often counterintuitive. Just the short discussion we had on must-move games. I mean, I think regardless of who is right, whether it's you or I, that's something that that discussion would be beneficial to a lot of cardroom managers.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
They would see both sides of this issue, and give them a better understanding as to.
Yeah. And especially, because the discussion that we had, we're not even in opposition here. We're of the same opinion of basically it has to be fair and it has to benefit everybody in a way that we're not losing these people walking in, right?
So one of the important points, which should have brought in earlier, is the idea that poker needs winning players. This is very different from any other casino game. And what do winning players do? They help start games, and they help keep games going. And it's a two-way street. One of my books, Poker Essays Volume 2, I have a paper in there that I wrote with Donna Harris. She was she's retired now, but she was a cardroom manager in Las Vegas. And we called it Cardroom Theory, a two-way street. And the idea of the paper was, we talked about those things that cardrooms needed to do for the regular players, and those things the regular players needed to do for a cardroom. And in my experience, a lot of cardrooms, you'll get an adversarial relationship between a lot of the regular players and the management. And when that happens, the cardroom goes down, and it's just over time it becomes a cardroom that's not as good as it used to be. But when both sides work together, things become good. And I think a lot of that's lost. And if anyone wants to, it's in that book. If anyone wants to look at the specifics, we had some of the specifics probably don't apply anymore. It's written in the early 90s, but a lot of the stuff, still does apply. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just one of the many things that is lost in these, in today's is too many of the poker pros are The only thing they think about is maximizing their expectation, and they don't think about what's good for the card room. And maybe it would be a little bit better if they reduced their expectation a little bit, but in the short run, but did things that were better for the card room. So in the long run, all this stuff is still there. And of course, the same is true on the card room side.
Yeah, that is the problem of, how do you, because even for players, let's say, who are willing to reduce their expectation for let's call it the better good, the bigger picture. If there are some bad actors in there, because like how many times that poker players try to boycott something just because they don't agree with the idea, and then the boycott always fails because, well, some people are just gonna go for, okay, I'm gonna maximize my own EV. Everybody else is sitting out. I'm gonna go for it, right? And that's the problem of getting this coordinated effort. So a lot of the changes
I think what has to happen there is you have to have more communication between these players and the management.
Yeah, I agree.
The management needs to understand why the players are unhappy, and the players need to understand why management can't do certain things and what their pressures are. I remember, again, this goes back years ago, but I had a conversation with a man named Jim Albrecht, and at that time he was director of the poker room at Binion's Horseshoe. And he was also running the World Series of Poker. And one of the things he told me, and I've never forgotten this, was that you go to a big major casino that has, 5 or 6 poker tables, and then that upper management would get more complaints out of those 5 or 6 poker tables than they would from the rest of the casino put together. And so one of the things that did, it made upper management very negative towards poker. And so he explained to me that part of his job was to make sure that these complaints stopped with him and didn't go to Jack Binion, who was the owner of Binion's Horseshoe at the time. And I think that's a fact that most of these professional type poker players aren't even aware of. Is all the issues that come out of a poker room because of the interaction between players and the short-term luck factor, and you've named a couple of, the list maybe aren't always kept as well as they should be, and so on. And, when that happens, it goes, right on up to, top manager of the casino instead of being, handled by the poker manager.
Yeah, and I'm sure that a lot of the poker players are aware that a lot of the complaints are coming from the poker floor because, well, let's face it, everybody sees the outspoken nature and the feeling of entitlement by a lot of people in that field. That's unfortunate. But anyway, the key point that you mentioned here is that the management should be in communication with the players, and the players should voice their opinions because, well, as you said, there's going to be 10 players, 10 opinions, but somewhere in there's the truth, right? Or at least something acceptable.
I think I think this is one of the big mistakes that gets made. Communication should be done more on an individual basis. In other words, the management should talk to you and hear what your opinions are. They shouldn't talk to you and 9 other people all at the same time. Then you get people just yelling louder than the other, and let an individual explain to the manager what he's unhappy with and why, and what the fixes he thinks should be. And it's a much more thoughtful discussion that way. Of course, it's more time consuming for the manager to have 10 meetings than to have 1 meeting. But I think it's the sort of thing that's missing in a lot of this poker stuff, whether it's a small poker room or a big event like the World Series of Poker.
Although I think this is getting better because I know that some of the bigger sites, if we're talking about the online industry, are actually actively talking to individual players and asking for opinions it remains to be seen how much those opinions are respected and such, but at least there is a dialogue, and that's
Right.
important.
And I assume that will happen, especially if the profit is going down.
Mm-hmm.
If they're having more and more problems, maintaining the profit and the goodwill. I mean, good. If you're, well, we used to have a thing with poker books. So this goes back years ago, but we used to object. This is when we could talk some to the book buyers from these big chains, but we used to object to bad books being on the shelf next to our books. We wanted all good books to be on the shelf next to our books, even if we weren't a publisher. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that was, if you as a you said as a new player you bought Harrington on Hold'em, and you learned a lot from that book. So what did you do? You came back and you probably bought 10 more books.
Oh yeah.
On the other hand, if you would have bought a bad book, and there was a lot of bad books at that time, you would have said, "This is silly. I'm not going to read any more of these poker books." Mm-hmm. So it was actually advantageous to us to have strong competitors than it was to have bad competitors. And I think that's still true today in some ways, just in poker in general. Mm-hmm. It's good for poker stars to have a competitor that's pushing them and doing things right, because then poker stars will respond in kind and push the competitor to do things right.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The problem starts when some of the competitors are in a different league in terms of regulation. So they can do things that are borderline questionable. And that's not good for anyone because, well, it's hard to compete against. And at the same time, it can create a very different perception to some of the incoming players about what the industry is all about. Because some of the sites, let's face it, they don't really care about the bots. They don't really care about the collusion. They don't really care about anything apart from just basically taking the rake while they can. And that's very unfortunate.
Well, I won't mention names, but we stopped the advertising on our site of a particular poker site because word had gotten out it was just full of odds. Mm-hmm. It actually cost us a substantial amount of money. And now I understand that site has made a lot of effort to clean up the problems.
Oh, yeah. And it all started with, because I think I know which site you're talking about, and it all started with people being outspoken, and it was good. Yeah. But there are some sites which are even less regulated and more questionable than that one, and there doesn't seem to be much incentive on their part to clean up their act because, well, their strategy is anyway, there's no longevity there because it doesn't seem like, because they're breaking so many laws and they are still allowed to operate. Well, at least operate. I don't know how they're allowed to operate, but they are there. And
a lot of times they might be breaking a law in the United States, but they're not really breaking a law in, let's say, Costa Rica, where they're operating from.
Yeah.
There's another thing which has, I would say, weakened a great deal because of the internet, and that is the fact that poker players tend to police their games. So if you're, I'm just speaking generically here, but if you're a very good poker player and you're playing in a game, you watch the other people. Mm-hmm. You watch how the hands unfold. And if something sort of funny happens, you'll notice it. And that's one of the main things that keep games honest. On the internet, now you're multi-tabling. And you just can't, it just isn't kept up as well. But players still do police the games on the internet. I mean, that's how some of the cheating scandals were uncovered. Mm-hmm. But the difference was a lot of damage was done before they were uncovered instead of being uncovered quickly. And
yeah.
There's a new cheating scandal now. I don't want to mention the guy's name, but apparently the thinking is he was, playing in this poker room, California, and he was getting maybe information on his cell phone as to what the cards were. And it seemed like that went on for a long time. And that almost says to me that the other players in the games we're not doing a good job policing it, which also says to me is that maybe some of them are in on it as well. That's pure speculation on my part. And so I don't want to accuse anybody of anything, but these things will happen if they're left unchecked.
Yeah. Well, people just default to trusting. It's usually a sane response to any situation. We tend to believe that things are clean and nice, so usually it's easier to get away with some of the things. And actually, all the cheating, well, not all the cheating, but some of the cheating scandals and some of the cheating techniques was the topic of some of my previous podcast episodes. And the other week I had Richard Turner, who is one of the, if not the best card magician in the world. And the things that he can do with a deck of cards, if you are in a game with where he is dealing or somehow participating with being able to manipulate the deck of cards, there's no way, even if you're paying closest attention, no way to ever be able to tell. And that's the unfortunate truth of, if somebody is doing the cheating right, you will not be able to tell, because all it matters is where the money is in the end of the day. You don't have to cheat every pot. If you do it selectively, good luck trying to figure it out. Yeah,
one hand a week can be a lot of money at the end of the year.
Exactly. About it. So, anyway, Mason, you know what? I want to say that, first of all, the forums that you have are so important, and I'm so grateful that we have this, because this is going to be instrumental. This has been instrumental to how the poker industry evolves, and I think it's going to remain there. And another thing, your book, first of all, what a great idea. And I went through it, most of it. I didn't finish it yet, but what a fascinating read. Really, really interesting. I'm sure that the poker players are really going to enjoy it, because it opens up, especially the guys who enjoy history like myself. I read some of these events. It's a refresher. Some of these events I haven't heard about before. And, to look at those from a different perspective is refreshing, is fun, is interesting. And my hope is also that, this might be one of those books which is going to be interesting for people outside of the poker industry and might make them want to try the game out. And my hope is just that when they try it out, they're going to like it, as opposed to get disillusioned and say, well, this is bullshit. I don't want to partake in this type of thing.
Yeah, we have to get a lot more sold than we currently have. But it could be a breakthrough book. We'll be lucky. That's going to require some luck, but it's just, to me, it is just a fascinating way to look at some of this stuff. And I know in the reading we did, I'd read about some topic and I would see something else mentioned casually. Mm-hmm. And then I'd go read that and bang, there would be a gambling event there. So that's how some of the topics got in the book. I never even heard of them until I started working on this book.
Mm-hmm. What was one or some of the events that you found the most surprising that you never heard about before?
Well, I wanted to read about Leon Trotsky. Mm-hmm. For some reason, I thought that he might be associated with gambling events. And we actually have a chapter on him. But reading about him, I discovered that in 1919, a war began. Maybe it was 1920, but a war began between Soviet Russia and Poland. Mm-hmm. Now, after World War I, Poland had become an independent country again. And the leader of Poland at that time, I can't say his name, I can't pronounce his name very well, but he realized that Poland being located between Germany and Russia was a problem. That eventually those two countries would rise up again and cause a lot of problems for Poland. And So he was he was clearly right about that. And he had an idea, which was to create a confederation of some of the Eastern European states, like Poland and Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, and so on. And problem was that what was then called Soviet Russia was already beginning to rise up. And Soviet Russia was dominating the Ukraine at the time. Trotsky had become the commissar of the army, so he was the number 2 person after Lenin, and they had defeated the White Russians in the Civil War, and now they occupied a good deal of Ukraine. So what this guy decided to do was he decided that to create a confederation, the first thing to have to do would be to invade Ukraine, and he thought that the Ukrainians, would then rise up and support his army. So that was his gamble, that the Ukrainians, would support him. Well, it turned out the Ukrainians didn't like anybody. They didn't like the Russians and they didn't like the Poles. But this was a war that started I think in 1919, went for a year or so, year and a half maybe. Mm-hmm. Did you ever hear of it?
Yeah, I did. I did hear.
No, you did. Well, you're one of the few people who actually heard of this war. I'd never heard of it.
Yeah, but the problem is, because I haven't heard about some of the American Civil War things, because I'm from a different part of the world. So that's closer to home to me, right?
Okay. Anyway, in this war, there was 400,000 casualties. I had never even heard of the thing. It was a major war.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's an example of one of the things that made the book, which, a year and a half ago when we started working on it, I had absolutely no knowledge of. The American Civil War had a great deal of knowledge. I've read a lot about that.
Yeah. And you see, that's another good part about this book that I really enjoyed, is that, because like I said, some of the events are a refresher for me, because both of the chapters that you mentioned about Trotsky and about the war of Poland against Ukraine and all that was a refresher to me, whereas some of the chapters about the American Civil War is news, right? I know the general idea of what happened in the Civil War, but I didn't really ever bother reading up on, such and such a battle and etc. But in this book, you have things from the Napoleonic Wars, you have things about Mexico, you have things about Russia, you have things about Middle East, about Israel, First World War, Second World War. There's so much in there, and it's not only war, it's not all military conflict, and that's it. But there's the kings and queens and whatnot. So I'm sure that people from different walks of life and different geographical locations are going to find a lot of things that are going to be interesting, fascinating to them. And it's overall an enjoyable, fun read. And the chapters are short. So, it's so easy to skim through. And, it's probably one of those books which it's definitely one of those books which you can pick up over and over again once in a while over a drink and just, have a little refresher of what happened in the world.
Yeah. Speaking of the American Civil War, I don't quite understand why. It just seemed to be a time where a lot of gambling went on. Mm-hmm. And something to do with the generals, and it has something to do with the nature of the events. But there's just a lot of stuff happened in the Civil War, including just, one of the sections in the book, as you know, is called the Roll of Luck, where just incredible lucky events occurred. And so there's a Civil War event, which was very significant in history, was just based on luck, pure luck.
Do you refer to the incident with the White House and the storm and
that was before. That was the War 1812. The incident I'm thinking of, right, actually there's a couple of chapters of the Roll of Luck. But the incident I'm thinking of right now was the finding of 3 cigars.
Oh, yeah, that one, yeah.
I mean, no one's going to know what I'm talking about to explain it, but early in the Civil War, again, the Confederate Army under Robert E. Lee had been very successful. So they moved into Maryland, which was part of the North. And the Union Army was again commanded by George McClellan, and they were trying to chase Lee and figure out, but they didn't really know exactly where he was. And then one day, some soldiers who were part of this huge army chasing Lee's army were camped out in a meadow, and they just happened to camp in a place that some Confederate soldiers had camped in a couple of days earlier. And they found 3 cigars with a piece of paper wrapped around them. And when they picked up cigars and unwrapped the paper, they realized they had just discovered Robert E. Lee's orders, which had been wrapped around these cigars and were being sent to another general and had been lost. Well, that made all the difference in the world. Now, George McClellan knew where Lee was, and he knew that Lee's army had been divided, so he now had a chance to stop him. And that led to the Battle of Antietam. And that did stop the advance of Lee's army. He had to retreat back into Virginia, and this was really the battle was actually a tactical draw, but it was a strategic defeat for the South. And one of the things the battle did was it allowed Lincoln to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. So these cigars weren't found. The freedom for the slaves might not have come. And I mean, you just wonder how these things happen, and yet there it was. Mm-hmm. The thing you're mentioning was in the War of 1812. The British landed south of the American capital, Washington, D.C. They marched towards the capital. They broke through the defenses, and they burnt the capital to the ground. Mm. And then a couple weeks later, another British force attacked the city of Baltimore and was stopped. Well, one of the things that happened was when the army that had burnt Washington, D.C. to the ground, that night the Americans had all fled, and the British were now occupying Washington, the city of Washington, and a storm hit. But it was a storm like no other storm, and it included maybe as many as 3 tornadoes, but definitely included one. And one of the tornadoes lifted up a couple of cannons and dropped about some of the British soldiers. And they actually had more casualties from the storm than they did from the battles. But the worst thing that happened was the army was wrecked. All their equipment was destroyed. So this army then all they could do is march back to their ships and leave. And so the British force that then attacked Baltimore a couple of weeks later was not as strong as it could have been. And that's when the United States prevailed. That didn't happen. The British might have split the United States into 2, and today you might have more than one country instead of just one United States. Mm-hmm. So it was a rainstorm, which could have been a hurricane, actually saved the United States. And what's interesting about it is Washington, D.C. is not a place that tornadoes hit, and it's not a place that hurricanes hit. And yet there it was on maybe its most crucial night in its history that happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And speaking of storms, I also found the story about the Japanese and the Mongols, where the Mongols were coming in and they were wiped out by the huge storm, and which sort of created the perception in the Japanese mind that they are protected by whatever the higher power, and that perception held all the way up till the end of the World War II, where they felt invincible. And
right. In fact, the word kamikaze means divine wind, and that was what these storms were called by the Japanese people at the time, as divine wind.
Right.
It's just very, very interesting what way a lot of these things come together, and how either my favorite story in the book, actually there's a couple of them, I've told this on a couple of the podcasts, well, first, you know who Jack Johnson was?
Jack Johnson, that's the boxer, or who?
Right. Jack Johnson in 1909 was the heavyweight champion of the world.
Right.
And he's African American, so he's the first black heavyweight champion. And in 1909, the United States was really a very racist country, like most of the world was. So he was not only easily the most hated person in the United States, he's probably the most hated person in the world. And he signed to fight a man named Stanley Ketchel, who was middleweight champion. And so Ketchel's a very legitimate fighter. The problem is the fight's still a mismatch. Johnson's 40 or 50 pounds heavier than he is, much, much taller and everything. So there's even, I don't have it in the book, but there's even a publicity picture where Ketchel has apparently he's standing on, he has platform shoes on, and he has a full-length coat that comes down to the ground. And Johnson's in his boxing attire, so this makes Ketchel look like almost the same size as Johnson. Anyway, the fight's a mismatch. So they make a deal, and the deal is that Johnson will carry him for 20 rounds. And I've seen it both ways, that it was supposed to be a 20-round fight or that the number of rounds was unlimited, but he would carry him for at least 20. And it was done for two reasons. One was to preserve Ketchel's reputation as a legitimate fighter, and the other was there were silent movie theaters in those days. So the idea was that the fight went enough rounds, people would then go to the silent movie theaters to watch the fight. Anyway, Ketchel had other ideas. So in the 12th round, he took his great gamble and he hauled off and hit Johnson as hard as he could. And he caught Johnson by surprise. We have a real nice picture of Johnson going down. And Johnson hopped right up. What the descriptions I read was he hopped up very annoyed. He ran to where Ketchel was standing. He hit him so hard, he knocked him out cold. So there's another picture I have in the book, which is 10 seconds later. Ketchel is out cold on the canvas. And it supposedly took several minutes to revive Ketchel. And the films of the fight clearly show Johnson walking over to the ropes, scraping his teeth out of his gloves. And after the fight, a sports writer asked Johnson what it felt like when he was knocked down. And Johnson said, he double-crossed me and I made him pay. And anyway, this chapter is in the foolish gamble section, because when gambling, you have to be a good judge of your adversary. And Ketchel obviously was not. He didn't understand that he just didn't have the power to hurt Johnson no matter what. And so it was a very foolish gamble, and he paid significantly for it. And it's also clear that the fight was probably fixed, because when Johnson decided to hit him, it was over.
Right.
He could have done that to him any time in the fight.
Yeah, exactly. I
have another story.
Interesting.
I have another story I've been telling a little bit, which I really like, out of the book. It actually comes out of another book called The Knights of the Green Cloth. It was written by a man named, I think it's Richard D. Arment, who's a University of Oklahoma professor. And it's a history of the gamblers of the Old West. So anybody wants to read a book that reads more like fiction than real life, this is the book to read. All these people are shooting each other up and everything. Anyway, it has a story in there about Wyatt Earp. And what most people remember Wyatt Earp. Do you know who he was?
No.
Any familiarity? Yeah, well, Wyatt Earp is remembered today as one of the great lawmen of the Old West. And he was involved in the famous shootout at the OK Corral. But in reality, Wyatt Earp was really mostly a casino owner. And what he would do is wherever there's a new mining boom, he would go to the new mining town and he would try to make a deal with a saloon owner, and they'd set up a couple of faro tables. And faro was the big table game back then. And then he would hire dealers and they'd run these games. So it was the year. I don't remember the year, but it was after the his time in Tombstone and the OK Corral shootout. He went to a place called Gunnison, Colorado, which was now the new mining boom town. He made his deal. He had his faro tables. And then one day into town came a man named Ike Morris. Well, Ike Morris was, according the quote from the book is, he's known as a mean man with a gun.
Mm-hmm.
So Ike Morris comes into town. He happens to go to the appropriate saloon, decides to play some faro. He sits down at the table, promptly loses his money. So as soon as he does this, he starts accusing the dealers of cheating. So the dealer says something like, "Look, I only work here. I work for wages. You'll have to talk to Mr. Earp. He'll be in later in the afternoon." So Morris says, "Okay, I'll be in the bar waiting for him." So Morris, I guess he goes in the bar and he starts shooting his mouth off. So as time goes on, a lot of people show up because they think there might be some real trouble between these two tough guys. So Earp comes in a couple hours later as on schedule. And one of the things about Wyatt Earp, apparently nothing ever bothered him. He never lost his cool, never got upset about anything. So Morris immediately accused him of cheating. Earp heard him out. And Earp said, "Well, let me go check everything out." So Earp goes back to, the gambling room where the faro tables are set up. He checks everything out. He talks to the dealers and becomes convinced that there's no way this guy was cheated. So every time I tell the story, it's just great. He comes out of the gambling room and he goes to the bar and he says to Morris, he says, "I looked over everything and you're right. You were cheated. And because of that, I should give you your money back. However, you're known as kind of a tough guy. And if I give you your money back, people are going to think you made me do it. Therefore, I'm going to keep it." And this is a huge gamble. What's happened here is he needs to get rid of Morris because he knows if he doesn't give Morris his money back, or he tells Morris he wasn't cheated, Morris will hang around for days, tell everybody he can how he was cheated, be bad for business. So Earp has just humiliated this guy, and Earp has just said to the guy, "Pull your gun or get out of town." And the gamble is that Morris might pull his gun and shoot him. But Earp gambled that he understood the guy and he knew him right and that he would back down. And sure enough, Morris backed down, offered to buy everybody drinks and left town in a day or so.
Mm.
So that, to me, that's one of the best gambling stories I've ever run into.
Mm. Yeah, what makes it so great is that the guy left the town. It could have gone the other way. We wouldn't have heard the story.
He just could have pulled his gun and shot. That would have been,
and then that story wouldn't be told.
It could have been the end of Earp.
Yeah. That's the problem with a lot of these stories. If we think back, that these minor events or seemingly minor events at the time skewed the whole outcome so much, and now we know about these events, whereas it wouldn't have happened. We would never have heard about it. Basically,
Right.
the selection bias. Well, that's part of it, and that's human nature. We remember our bad beats. We remember, all sorts of stories that stand out for us on an emotional level. But yeah. Oh, well, Mason, listen, I want to say thank you for your time. It was
thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. It was so interesting, and I think we covered so many topics, and I really hope that people are going to go out and buy the book because it is a great read. It's a fun read. It's really entertaining, and it's, like I said, it's one of those which you're probably going to go back once in a while. I know I will, and it's an easy, fun read, and definitely a lot of refresher if somebody's interested in the historic events. There's so much in there, and you selected a good balance of things from all around the world. You covered.
Well, I had a very good co-author to work with. He was a real help in all that stuff. And next time you're in Las Vegas, contact me. We'll bring you out to the office, have lunch one day.
Oh, absolutely! I'd love that. Yeah, I'm definitely not going this year. I mean, that's probably no surprise. Yeah, it's not easy to go over the ocean nowadays, but whenever things get better, I'm looking forward to. I actually miss playing live poker. It's I didn't think I would, but now that it's taken away from me, I definitely do.
Good talking to you. Thanks again for having me. It's been my pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to get a regular email from me personally, where I share my key takeaways from each latest episode, go to runchukspodcast.com and subscribe to my newsletter. And of course, I would really appreciate if you subscribe to my channel on YouTube and rate my podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or any other platform where you normally listen to your podcasts. This really helps.